Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to this discussion about rethinking humanitarian reform. I'm Hiba Ali, the CEO of the New Humanitarian, an independent nonprofit newsroom that reports from the heart of crises around the world. And our mission is to contribute to more effective, more accountable, more inclusive action to improve the lives of people affected. Some of you may be aware that last year, on the occasion of our 25th anniversary, we launched a series called Rethinking Humanitarianism, where we explore how aid has changed over the last quarter century and where it goes from here. And together with the Center for Global Development, the host of today's event, we also launched a podcast series by the same name. We've just launched season 2, and the conversation today is also being broadcast on the Rethinking Humanitarianism podcast. That's why you see my microphone here. So welcome to all the RH listeners as well. Fitting then, I guess, that as part of Rethinking Humanitarianism, we are today rethinking humanitarian reform. And we all know the context we find ourselves in today. Global need for humanitarian aid is at an all-time high. And for the first time ever, the UN appeal for funding to respond to crises around the world last year was less than half funded. So we have protracted crises, the growing impact of climate change, and the yet to be fully felt, I think, effects of the pandemic, which are only going to increase the needs in the coming years, just as funding to respond to them is beginning to plateau. And yet, well, for me, the humanitarian sector in its current state is reaching its financial limits, its operational limits, its ethical limits, and is no longer necessarily the right tool in its current form for today's challenges. We've heard all the buzzwords around localization, anticipation, diversification, and yet the dominant business model continues to be discretionary donations to a narrow set of international actors that deploy after a disaster strikes. And we all thought that COVID was going to upend all of that and be a watershed moment, a reset button, whatever you want to call it. And yet donors and agencies have largely retrenched to familiar practices that put frontline actors last in the delivery chain. So over the last 3 years, the Center for Global Development has tried to understand how operational practice, financial incentives, and governance structures have entrenched power imbalance in the humanitarian sector, have reduced the scope for the system to be genuinely driven by and accountable to the people it serves. And as a result of that research, it has proposed what I think are very concrete proposals for making the humanitarian response architecture more centered on the people it's meant to serve. A summary of that research will be released shortly. And I found it particularly interesting because we talk a lot about reform, but in ways that are easy to agree with and then dismiss without really taking any action. And yet these are a set of, I think, really concrete architectural changes that force the players in the sector to have to take a position. Like, are you ready to do this or aren't you? So what I'm going to try to do today in this discussion is to probe each of those recommendations. Are they practical? What would it take for the relevant players to be ready to take them on board? What would get in the way? And to really, start taking some concrete reflections towards putting these things into practice. We invite you as well to ask your questions on Twitter, on YouTube, by email, and you'll see that information on your screen below, and I'll try to get to them towards the end of the event. So to kick things off, I'm going to ask Patrick Saez, a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development, to give us an overview of the findings and the recommendations, and then we'll jump in. Patrick, over to you. And you'll just need to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Heba, and welcome to all our panelists today. I'm really thrilled that you were all able to join us for this discussion. As Heba was saying, this is the culmination of a research project started around 3 years ago by Jeremy Canandike and Rose Walden, which I joined about 2 years ago. And the premise really was that, of course, the humanitarian system has done and is doing a lot of good things. But as Heba was saying, it is constantly and increasingly under pressure financially, politically, and in terms of its legitimacy. And despite decades of reform, there are some very sticky issues that haven't been resolved, notably the need to put people at the center in practice rather than only in rhetoric, and to be accountable to them, and also to enable locally driven humanitarian action. And we argue that progress has been slow in those areas because reforms haven't been transformative. They haven't really fundamentally changed the power balance and incentives that are at the heart of the humanitarian architecture and business model. And as Heba was alluding to, 2020 has been a year where the status quo has been challenged even further by the pandemic, because it has put into question the relevance of a system that's completely driven by international organizations rather than local ones. And of course, the Black Lives Matter movement and the calls to decolonize the aid sector. So we have proposed steps towards more radical changes to the underlying architecture in 4 areas: participation and accountability, coordination, financing, and governance. First, we propose establishing independent accountability mechanisms. We really need to move beyond technical approaches to accountability to affected people and start reshaping those power structures that influence decision-making in the system. And feedback and accountability mechanisms shouldn't be mediated by the same agencies whose work they assess. They should be independent and report directly to the governing boards, to donors, to governments, and to the public. And we need more formal channels for feedback to influence decision-making at all levels. And this will require individual organizations, but also the coordination structures, for example, of the IASC, to evolve to establish mechanisms for this to happen. Second, we propose to review the coordination architecture. The clusters have done wonderful things and introduced a lot of predictability in how humanitarian aid is organized. But they were established 15 years ago, so maybe now is the time for a rethink, because they have also entrenched fragmentation and power imbalance, particularly because the vast majority of funding is channeled through cluster lead agencies. So borrowing from the principles of area-based programming, we suggest that planning and financing should be increasingly organized around geographical areas and holistic needs rather than technical sectors. And this doesn't mean doing away with the clusters. We think that their normative and technical assurance roles are essential and should definitely remain. But we think that more of that program cycle function should be devolved to subnational hubs where the leadership could be open to a wider range of actors, including local actors. Third, we have suggested more radical changes to the financing architecture. We currently have a system that is basically based around discretionary projectized grants from donors, and that is the source of many inefficiencies because it treats protracted and predictable crises as if they were unforeseen emergencies. And there has been progress on anticipatory finance, and that is very welcome. But we propose going further by pre-arranging a relatively sizable amount of humanitarian finance for these crises, and pre-arranging them in the same way that the multilateral development banks or Gavi, for example, are replenished, so that they can be allocated to funding crises based on objective data on their relative severity rather than the preference of donors. We also have a system currently where the main financial intermediaries are the large UN agencies and large international NGOs. And this reinforces silos and creates long delivery chains, as we've seen at the beginning of the COVID response, as Heba mentioned. We suggest that at the country level, a critical mass of funding should be channeled through pooled mechanisms that are multi-sectoral in nature, and that can allocate funding according to objective data on need. And finally, we have a system where core functions in the humanitarian system are financed through overheads on those project grants. And we propose moving to a much more predictable model where there is an agreement between donors and international agencies on the core functions of the international system, and there are many, and how much they cost or should cost, and how to resolve them more predictably through core funding rather than overheads. Finally, we propose to adapt governance structures in the system so that they measure effectiveness not only in terms of direct delivery by an organization, but also in terms of partnerships, and not only in terms of budgetary growth or influence, but also in terms of humanitarian outcomes. And this, we think, requires finding ways to better represent affected communities on governing boards, on humanitarian country teams, but also empowering national actors to take the lead whenever possible, and opening the system beyond the IASC structures to a broader range of actors through multi-stakeholder platforms. We also think that the measurement of outcomes, in particular collective outcomes, should be done independently and directly inform those governing structures. And we have a growing practice of independent accountability audits and independent perception surveys in crisis response that provide a useful basis for on which to do that. So these are some of our ideas. They're definitely not silver bullets. They're not comprehensive, but they attempt to show that structural changes are actually possible. And in terms of process going forward, I think that following the review of the Grand Bargain, we all as a community have a choice to make. As that review of the Grand Bargain found, and as we found ourselves through our research, there is overall agreement on the diagnostic of the problems and on the need for a forum to discuss where changes are needed and how to implement them. But there's also been a tendency to focus on technical changes rather than the more structural ones that require political decisions. And there's a whole array of narratives to justify delaying those more structural changes. So do we embark on yet again another top-down reform process based on individual commitments? Or do we need a mechanism to monitor collective change much more closely at the country level? Or instead, do we focus on amplifying change that is already happening, for example, to coordination structures or financing at the country level? Or do we continue to focus on individual commitments? I'll leave those questions open, and I really look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, for laying that out. And maybe just a quick follow-up before we jump in. I mean, you've laid out a series of meaty propositions that are, in a sense, interrelated. And I wonder how you see them playing out. Does one take precedence? Does one have to happen before the others can? Is this a simultaneous or sequential kind of rollout to your mind?
I mean, they are all interrelated. I mean, in particular, you know, finance has a role to play in all of them, for example, but I don't think that there is necessarily a sequence that should be adapted in how they are applied. I mean, some of these approaches are tested in one way or another already in the system. They're not entirely new. I think rather than sequencing, we should probably look at them in terms of ambition and, you know, whether they require political level decisions, for example, to replenish a global humanitarian mechanism. That's quite meaty in terms of its political ambition. But, you know, accountability mechanisms can be established at the country level now and linked to humanitarian country teams or humanitarian response plans.
Interesting. I see some of our panelists nodding, so I'm gonna introduce them now. We've assembled a group of people to react to these proposals and to reflect a little bit on what would allow reform to really take hold. They represent each of the main players, UN agencies, international NGOs, local NGOs. Unfortunately, we did have a donor representative who had to drop out at the last minute. So forgive us for that, but here are the voices we have with us. Annika Sunderland, who is the Head of Partnership and Coordination at the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. Danny Sriskandaraja, Chief Executive of Oxfam GB, and Alix Masson, the Advocacy Lead at the NEAR Network of local and Southern organizations. So before we delve into the specific research of CGD, I wanted to first kind of get our bearings. And I think to understand what can make humanitarian reform work in the future, we need to first understand what has held it back in the past. So if I can ask each of you what you think the biggest obstacle has been to really seeing these kinds of reforms take hold until now. And maybe Danny, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Heber. It's great to be here. And for me, it's the point, you know, your question to Patrick just now about sequencing. For me, it's about understanding, you know, who's got the lowest threshold to be an early mover, right? Where's the least points of resistance? And I think as a sector, we haven't understood where each of us could lead by example, and not sort of leaning into it, because you know, we often ended up, you know, there's no shortage of challenges we're all facing individually, institutionally, you know, sectorally. And I think we've lost the confidence to say we have also a responsibility to lead by example. And you just need to find where can we plow our own sort of furrow. And I think that's, to me, that we haven't sort of had the confidence to take the bull by the horns, if I can mix metaphors.
Alix.
Thank you, Eva. I'm going to follow up on what Danny just said and reacting on the sequencing. One of the things that for me is quite interesting throughout all the different proposals that have been put forward is that all of them require significant investment on national actors themselves. And we have never talked about this investment and how to reinforce today national actors, being national coordination mechanisms that are nationally led, not international coordination mechanism, for example, that are in countries. How do we reinforce them? How do we provide them with the necessary skills, scale to actually take their role? Because at the moment, most of them are poorly funded or not funded or self-funded by organizations that don't really have necessarily the funds to do that, but it's the same around the funding issue. There is always the conversation that there is not enough capacity in the global south. That's really a motto that we have all heard. There is not enough capacity to lead. There is not enough capacity to manage funds. But when did we actually invest in those capacities? When did we invest in national funds that have the ability? So at the moment, we know that there are a number of different pilots, either completely nationally driven or mixed models that are beyond the what we know best, the CBPF, but those are the kind of investment that also need to be thought through long term. It's not something that is going to change in 2 years, but that's the expectation. The expectation is that in the next 2 years, local actors somehow are going to rise to the challenge. While I think we need to be much more in this sense in a development mindset, and to also recognize that there is a need to invest there so that we can see what can work. And as Danny said, there are pilotings. As Patrick said, there are pilotings in the system, and I think this is really what we need to look at and what we need to start really dive in and invest in, and that's really what I would emphasize at this point.
Okay, so perhaps not enough focus on where is the lowest threshold to be an early mover, a lack of investment in building the capacity of local actors. Annika, from your perspective, what has held back past attempts at humanitarian reform?
So first, just joining the others to say delighted to be here and happy to engage in this discussion. I do agree with both Danny and Alex in the sense that one of the big obstacles clearly is caution in terms of humanitarian reform. I think the debate has been quite polarized big actors versus small actors, international versus local. And I don't think that's a helpful sort of starting point, because I think it has made everyone a little bit defensive, which is obviously really not sort of helpful. I think there are actors that have tried to sort of find a niche where they can lead. I'm thinking in terms of Oxfam, in terms of localization, for example, in the Grand Bargain setting. Other actors, including UN agencies on sort of specific areas, but even jointly, they don't really amount to a reform of the system. And I guess if you're looking at the reform of the system, we do need to recognize that it's also about power and shifting power balances. It is, as Alex says, about really realizing that an investment is needed. It's not just going to shift like that. And it's not, and we do, as different actors in the system, we hold different types of power as well. And they can be complementary. And I think we need to look at that complementarity as well. So it's not a sort of a win-lose game, but it's a win-win game. So those, I think, are a few of the sort of main obstacles that I can come to think of that has, I think, really held us back. And then the last one, I'm sorry to introduce that when we don't have the donor with us. I mean, there is really an increase in humanitarian needs around the world. And I'm not sure that we have quite reached the level where we want to be, all of us, when it comes to multi-year funding, to flexible funding, to unearmarked funding, that allows for that kind of experimentation. So if the money is projectized, it's very difficult to find the money needed to experiment within the type of system we have now in terms of financing. And that, I think, is true for all actors around this table. Thank you.
Yes, I was waiting for someone to talk about political will, which usually is the first answer to that question. Patrick, do you have anything to add on from that point of view in terms of kind of realpolitik as to what has held back past reforms? I think in your talk, you talked about them kind of being targeted perhaps at the wrong problems.
Not sure I have to add much more in terms of realpolitik, because I think this is often branded as an excuse for lack of change, but it's quite poorly defined. I think for me, what maybe has in terms of the processes itself of humanitarian reform and the Grand Bargain is this focus on individual commitments rather than setting out an objective and measurable goal collectively. So, for example, as Alice was saying, if we really want localization, we should invest in local actors. Where do we want them to be in 5 or 10 years' time? Can it be measured along the way? We don't have that as we have, for example, for the SDGs or other processes. And it's also this disconnect between those global agreements and what's happening on the ground, where there is a bit of experimentation. So I really think we need to connect the dots there.
I had a conversation recently with someone who was suggesting something like an SDG framework for the humanitarian sector. And then the minute that gets said out loud, people say, oh, no, please, no. So I don't know if that's fully what you're suggesting, but let's dive into some of your recommendations. So let's take the first one, the independent accountability mechanism. And it's an interesting concept, of course, because the status quo is that agencies are policing themselves for the most part. Over the last, 2 decades, many kind of self-regulation initiatives have been set up, quality assurance, accountability, common technical standards. And I think many agencies are complying with that. But as Dorothea Hilhorst, who is a humanitarian aid professor, put in an op-ed published by the New Humanitarian during the Me Too scandals, the problem is not a lack of standards, it's a lack of third-party enforcement and meaningful sanctions. And I think that's what your proposal starts to get at. And so I wonder, maybe we can start with you, Danny. Of course, Oxfam has had a very public battle with safeguarding issues, and that includes a lack of openness initially after information about abuse emerged. And so I'm imagining, had that information, been reported to a governance board rather than internally, would the response have been different? We've seen a number of initiatives, as I mentioned, the Humanitarian Quality Assurance Initiative, independent measurements against the common humanitarian standards, et cetera. How well have they worked if what happened at Oxfam was still able to happen?
Yeah, look, I think where Patrick and colleagues have started, which is with accountability to affected populations, or the participation revolution, is the obvious and best place to start. Because I think, I live in London. I am involved in a health foundation. I chair a committee about long-term health issues in my locale. We have patient reps on the board and on the committees. And it would be unthinkable in a health foundation not to have patient voice in the conversation at the highest levels. And yet when I travel around the sort of humanitarian sector, it's sort of so rare to have sort of voice of those affected populations anywhere near the top tables in our sector. And I think we have to, as a sector, sort of hold ourselves collectively responsible for failing on that front. And it can't be the excuse that we're so distant from people, because we've got so much intermediation that we justify its existence because we say, well, this gives us better quality outcomes. We can, so I think this is a great starting point. To your sort of framing of it, Heber, I think, yes, before we get to sector-wide initiatives, which I do, and independent initiatives, which I do support, I think each of our institutions also have to ask ourselves, are we investing sufficiently in high quality feedback loops? Whether that's around community perceptions, on safeguarding and accountability, employee engagement, and we have to do better at this. It's cheaper and easier and more effective than ever before, using especially digital tools, but not only digital tools, for us to do that. So we can't even say any longer, oh, this is too difficult. And so I think part of what we're trying to do at Oxfam is to invest internally around staff mechanisms, independent mechanisms. And I do think there is a role for more sector-wide initiatives. They'll be probably more cost-effective and hopefully increase trust. My only concerns when I read the recommendation is that doing things at a sector-wide basis and with independence might improve assurance for, say, donors, particularly institutional donors, but I'm not entirely convinced they will necessarily improve the quality of outcomes for the affected population. I.e., we create these, again, top-down donor-led mechanisms that might drive greater assurance, but still fail to do. I know that's not the point of what Patrick and colleagues are saying for why they're suggesting this, but I think we have to be extra careful, because it's almost the more aggregated something becomes, or more cross-sectoral it becomes, the more susceptible it is to once again being top down. So, but I welcome both investment within our organizations and institutions, but also more independent sector-wide initiatives.
So if we take the sector-wide initiative, staying with that level, the former UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mark Lowcock, had introduced a similar kind of idea, right? An independent commission for what he called for voices in crisis, conveniently introduced on his way out. But anyway, that would issue public reports on the needs prioritized by people in a given crisis, that would then rate the humanitarian response plans on how well they responded to those needs, and then publicly evaluate the humanitarian response. And that proposal didn't really pick up any steam, even coming from someone in such a position of influence. So Annika, maybe I can come to you. Why do you think that didn't work? And how would this need to be different in order to be palatable, including to UN agencies like yours?
It's a good question, and I think looking at the positive side, it was heartwarming to hear a UN official at such high level, put the focus on accountability to affected populations, because I think that was, as you mentioned, the timing wasn't necessarily ideal, but the actual spotlight, I think, was helpful. I think if you look at why it failed, I would think of three sort of main main points, maybe. One was that it wasn't really consulted. It wasn't consulted internally with agencies. I'm not sure it was consulted with any of the affected populations themselves. It was top-down. And I think, it's not only Me Too and Black Lives Matters and all the other movements, but, even within the aid sector, this day and age, that consultation is sort of seen as just necessary. So I think that was a big, that was unfortunate, and that was really one of the reasons that I think it just didn't, unfortunately, it didn't really go anywhere. I think the other thing was that it didn't really take into account the strides that has been made in the past 5 years. I mean, both globally under the ISC and sort of results group there, but also at country level. And I mean, clearly we have a long way to go, but there is a lot of lessons learned already that could be built upon, and which I think is, it's unfortunate that wasn't really taken into account, because I think that also meant that people then thought, restart. It was like restarting a conversation all over.
What are those lessons?
So, for example, we put in a results tracker in terms of accountability. We have, for example, in Iraq, we have a mechanism that is sector-wide, not agency, not sector-specific, looking at and complaints mechanisms. I think we've realized that these complaints mechanisms are actually also useful for safeguarding, because if they are independent enough, people will report all kinds of issues into it, and that also needs to then be taken into account when it comes to how you design these mechanisms and make sure that they're safe. So I think there are quite a few things that have been sort of put in place by different agencies, and I completely agree that it needs to be system-wide, but still we can build, and we should build on what is already there. And then the last one, and this is maybe more personal, but I did read the proposal quite a few times, and what it proposed was a process to evaluate processes, right? To evaluate the process around the humanitarian response plan, and it aggravated it at a higher level. And I'm not saying that's not, a good idea, but will that include, will that actually help us improve our results? And again, you're asking the intermediaries, and it doesn't ask directly the people affected. So I think there were several reasons for why it sort of failed. But as I said in the beginning, the plus side is that it shone a spotlight on the right issue. Then if I look at sort of the other sort of things that I think we've realized, Heba, you were asking about the lessons learned, is that maybe there isn't one way to do things. Maybe there isn't one perfect solution for how we collect feedback from ourselves and from beneficiaries. So I'm just thinking about a few of the things that we've done at UNHCR. We have a refugee-led gender audit team that audits us on our gender achievements, and they can be quite critical, but I think it's really, really, really helpful. We also have a refugee use advisory team that looks specifically at different policies and comes up with, comments to on how we can do better. And this is for global level processes, of course. And then at the country level, for many years now, we've had sort of an age and a diversity matrix, so that you ask different segments of the beneficiaries different questions, and that way you ensure that it's not only the men, for example, speaking, or that the voices are representative across the different population groups, and takes into account things like disability and barriers that exist in all societies, including my own, to ensure that people, different population groups, different types of populations can really make their voices heard. And finally, I would say, if you open this up, which I really think we should, I think we need to be very prepared for the fact that many people will comment on things that are beyond humanitarian aid, which is great, right? Because, nobody actually wants, nobody wants to be a refugee, nobody wants to stay a refugee, nobody wants to be dependent on humanitarian aid. And of course, it matters who delivers it and how it's coordinated. But in my experience, what people ask, especially from the UN, is accountability on a completely different level. They want justice. They want accountability for crimes committed towards them. They want us to fight for their rights. All of those things that are sort of beyond humanitarian aid, and things that we also, we need to listen to them. We need to make sure that their voices are heard beyond the humanitarian community and beyond what we sort of, what we're able to offer. And I think we have a great role to play there, and that's also, needs to kind of be part of the conversation, because otherwise you're asking questions that are maybe not giving people, the full experience of really getting their voices heard and being able to sort of highlight what they think is the most important thing for them and not what we can deliver.
I take that point. And I think that it is very interesting that some of these processes are so insular that sometimes they miss the point. But I will note that both of you have kind of said, well, let's come back to our own agency-specific processes. And the problem with that is, of course, that what's different about this proposal is that the feedback from affected communities doesn't go back to the same agency that they are feedbacking on. It goes to an independent body or a board of governance. So I just wanted to clarify, is that something that you are both open to in that really external kind of oversight?
Yes, and I'm saying it's not either or, it's both, right? And I think, Annika made a very good point that there's no one right answer, partly because, depending on why you want feedback, you will end up with very different looking mechanisms. If this is about needs assessment, it might look in one way. If it's about complaints, it needs to look a different way. If it's about measuring quality of outcome, it might look a third way. And so I think we just have to be clear about why we're pursuing feedback. And then I keep coming back to the institutional point because of where I started around, paths of least resistance. Working as I have now for 3 years inside an INGO like Oxfam, for us, the vision is how do we sort of lead by example in a realm of control that we have, which is our own governance, our own structure, the way that we work, and can we evolve into something that's much more interesting, more accountable, more 21st century. And so I'm not saying we don't need sector-wide initiatives. We almost certainly do, especially around sort of collective assurance and trust and all of those sorts of things. But that shouldn't stop us from improving our own practice within our own organizations, because that might be the easiest thing to do. And we don't have all of those beautiful things that Patrick tells us sort of limit ambition and limit action, because you can do this. You just need to find the way where you can make that difference.
Yeah, and I talked for a very long time, so I'll be short, but yes, definitely. I think it's both. It's improving our own systems, but it also is about the collective improvement and independent ways of measuring what we're doing. So both.
Hiba, just to follow up on what Annika was saying, I think her last point was actually exactly the point that I wanted to make, based on a lot of feedback we got from our members who feel that they are often put in very difficult situation where they are asked to collect feedback from communities, because often they are the national implementers, right? The partners, as they are called. But then the feedback doesn't have any impact, because exactly as Annika started to point out, the feedback is usually not confined to what the donor wants to hear. It's confined to the situation of people and how they see their future, how they see what they need to be provided with, being funding, being expertise, being support, being investment. And then the usual response is that, yeah, but that's not what we do. This is not the programming we do. And I think here, and that would take us in another conversation, but this is where we are saying, if we really want to change the aid system, we need to look at triple nexus not as a way to sort of patch and create bridges between systems, but really as what the system should be. That the aid system should look at people and communities and their needs in a holistic way, not in a way that is sort of boxed in depending on when and where during a crisis or before or after you are seeking, you're in the need of support. And that's really fundamentally the question. The other question is, again, around power. When someone tells you, I need that, but that you're not ready or that that's not what you decided was best or the best way of doing it, who wants to give up that power? And more importantly, if you really look back, which donors actually want to not have control on how and where they give their money? That's part of their foreign policies. That's part of their positioning in the world. So there is a really strong difficulties, which is understandable in many ways, to actually give that power. But ultimately, if we want to hear and really listen to what communities are saying, this is really where the shift also needs to happen. And that's, I mean, that would have been great to have a donor, of course, to hear from them on that particular point. But ultimately, this is where it loops back. So having a system-wide element would be great, but is that going to change something? Whether it is internal to agencies or whether it's outside, is it going to change the will to shift the power and to give powers to the community and to listen to what they want?
But I think what you're getting at there is a kind of wider challenge with all of the past efforts at reform, which is that there's no overarching body that can change the system. It's this fragmented bunch of agencies, and it almost speaks even more to the need for not only a system-wide within the humanitarian sector, but an even bigger kind of coordination body that pulls all of these efforts together and allows for some change to be kind of decided and coordinated among a much wider group of people, and to be able to then trickle that down all the way through the system. And I do want to move on to some of the other recommendations, but Patrick, just really briefly, how do you overcome that challenge, that there isn't nobody that you can, no one central place that you can influence that then has that broader kind of trickle down effect on things like, well, this is outside of the scope of this particular agency or of the system as a whole?
Yes, I'm not sure that I've got the answer to that, but I think that starting from that very top level of, we need, if we collect feedback in country X, we need a global mechanism to channel that feedback. I'm not sure that's the right equation, because we are increasingly in the past few years, with ground truth solutions, etc. Those kind of perception surveys of what people think of the aid they're getting, etc. Is starting to be collected, and we know from that information that people are generally not satisfied and they don't feel listened to. So it might be at the country level that there could be an initiative to actually channel that into how things are being planned and implemented, rather than at a global level. And starting with what we've got now, rather than reinventing the wheel. So how do you channel that feedback, for example, into the humanitarian response plan process? I'm not sure that that's being done at the moment. HRPs have, for example, increasingly a set of outcomes attached to them, but you don't see in the following years those outcomes being measured or report on progress against those outcomes. So it's definitely not part of the collective practice to do this, and I think that we should be pushing in that direction, but building on what's being tried already.
Heba, can I add just one thing there? Because I just thought, Patrick, you have an extremely good point on the sort of country level, the meaningfulness of doing this also at the country level, and maybe even starting from the country level in some cases. So just a very concrete and sort of simple suggestion is to ensure that there are a formalized sort of community representation across different coordination structures, including at the HCT level. So of course, Danny, as you said, of course, you need to know what you want, why you're asking questions, because the reason why will get you different mechanisms possibly and different answers. But just sort of a few of those simple things on country level, I think, would make a difference, also because that's not only having, affected communities being asked, what they think about what is being given, but really, being present at the design stage. and even before the HRP process sort of kicks in. So just throwing it out there as sort of a way of engaging affected communities better. And of course, there's an issue of who represents who, but you know, I don't think that should stop us from trying to make a start in that direction. And it's not so complicated to achieve that.
Interesting to see already as you start to kind of dig into these recommendations, you're in some way addressing the challenges that we talked about at the beginning, which was we weren't going for the low-hanging fruit. We weren't seeing where each of us could already start making some changes, and this kind of country level approach sounds like it starts to get at that. I want to move to the second recommendation because it's also a bit a question of this global level versus country level question that I find quite interesting, because I took part in an experiment years ago at the Overseas Development Institute called Constructive Deconstruction, in which participants were encouraged to use design thinking to ways of designing the humanitarian sector in a way that would be more better for the end user. And this idea actually emerged from it. So it's interesting to see it resurfacing again. Annika, the concept, if I've understood it well, and Patrick, correct me if I haven't, is that instead of a mandate-based response where, you know, the World Food Program has food to supply, and so it will go into a certain place and find all those people who need food and give them food, and the UN Refugee Agency will be helping refugees, so it will go and find refugees and give them support, that you would be instead looking at a much more regional approach to say, in this particular region, what are the needs of the people, and provide a collective response. UNHCR is, of course, currently mandated to coordinate situations of displacement. But the research argues that clusters led by agencies like UNHCR contribute to entrenching these unhelpful funding practices. And to be frank, we've seen in a lot of our reporting and territoriality and competition when it comes to UN mandates. So this idea of a more collective kind of area-based response would require you, if I've understood correctly, to be ready to kind of limit your role in the clusters and let others coordinate at a local level. So I'd love to hear what you would need to be ready to do that.
Yeah, no, I think the sort of area-based approach makes a lot of sense. And I think that's definitely something that it's worth sort of looking at across population groups. So refugees, IDPs, vulnerable host communities, etc. And I think from UNHCR's perspective, just talking about the refugee response maybe before getting to the protection cluster specifically, I mean, our greatest revolution in the past 5 years is the Global Compact on Refugees. And that's very much about also an area-based approach and making sure that the refugees are supported alongside the host communities, so not specifically the refugees, and looking at bringing in a wider set of partners, not only local actors, but also faith-based organizations or entities that might have a lot of power on a different level than we do. Private sector, academia, research institutes, etc., etc. So on the sort of refugee side, I think, you know, the Global Compact also does speak to a kind of area-based approach. I mean, it's not one-to-one, but it's going sort of, it has a similar impetus. On the cluster side, I mean, I'm so old in the humanitarian system that I, you know, I was in the tsunami response with a 2-month-old baby, but I do remember like 300 different shelter actors coming and building toilets on our garden, and we really didn't need a toilet, and we really didn't want them in our garden either. It was really chaos on the dance floor, so to say. Sorry, that's a very bad analogy. Anyway, just to say, it didn't. I do think the cluster system has brought a lot of clarity when it comes to including who coordinates who, and it has brought structure, especially in the IDP response, and it was of course born out of a perceived or real failure, especially of the UN, to sort of get its act together in IDP responses. So So I think we need, and I know, Patrick, that you are not saying let's get rid of the cluster system. You're saying let's work on a hybrid, but I just want to point out that some of that predictability in coordination, I actually think is one of the good sides of the clusters. And that doesn't mean that local actors can't coordinate with themselves at the local level and with other actors at the local level. That's all great and should clearly be pursued. But at the same time, I think the role of the clusters, I mean, I would take a different approach, to be quite honest. I would look at, and in my view, a more radical approach. I would not go into setting up many clusters at the subnational level and replicating a system that we're not even sure is great to start with. I would turn it around. I think the local actors have coordination structures that function, well or less well. And there's a lot we can learn from the local actors, and maybe we, should try to see how we fit into the systems that exist, rather than sort of replicate our system on different levels and think that achieves localization. So I would be more for trying to limit the timeline of a cluster, of all clusters, and looking at transfer of power, as soon as possible. And I realize that that's not always possible, and in some contexts that's not the right thing to do, because you have humanitarian principles and other things that are in danger, and you do need to remember sort of the slogan of the World Humanitarian Summit as local as possible, but as international as necessary. And I think limiting a protection cluster in Afghanistan or Syria, Myanmar to a technical normative setting role, I think that just doesn't get to the heart of protection, which is, it's not about what the protection actors do, although that's hugely important. It's about the whole system, and it's about enforcing rights, and it's just much broader than any single cluster. And I realize that maybe, sorry, Heba, I'm talking a lot, but I do think this is really, really important. So I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I just think it needs, I would be more radical. I would look at it from a slightly different point of view, but all for area-based approaches and looking at how we can do things better in collaboration with local actors, but really listening to them in terms of what they want us to do.
Well, we'll hear from Alix in a minute about what they want you to do. But Patrick, have we interpreted what you're proposing right? Because you're not suggesting to set up clusters at this subnational level. If I understood, we're talking about not even moving away from the whole cluster system.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Say again?
Precisely not establishing clusters at the subnational level because they haven't been very, very good, but also because they, we've seen in experiments of area-based approaches and coordination that it works better to work across sectors rather than within sectors. So, I mean, to respond to Annika, I think I would agree basically that this shouldn't be about replacing what organizations are doing, for example, in terms of coordination, but it's really about embedding maybe coordination within other priority needs and making sure that the response is coherent and funded appropriately, and that the emphasis on one activity or another is not decided because there's more funding coming through UNHCR for the protection cluster, but because that's really the greatest need on the ground. And completely agree with you that local coordination mechanisms could be basically the leadership of those area-based hubs.
So Alix, are local NGOs ready to take that kind of a role in coordinating a response within a certain area, instead of having UNHCR coordinating refugees and WFP coordinating food?
I think if that would be set up, like if that would be the new way of operating, then here we would actually talk about shift of power and we would talk about localization. That because finally we would have an international support system that is embedding itself in existing mechanism and not coming in and setting up a system disregarding anything that exists already in the country. So that would be already, I mean, that here, I think that would be one example of really what it means to be complementary and what it means to trust local leadership. We have seen in a number of countries that yes, local and national NGOs do have this capacity, and they do it. When there is a crisis, when there is a need, they do coordinate themselves. They are not usually waiting for international actors to come in, especially in the areas where the needs are. So whether they are ready everywhere, I am not sure. Whether they have, whether they all have the capacity to manage the influx of international agencies coming in their country, that's also another conversation. And here I'm referring back to the investment aspect, but where then the investment is on their mechanism to actually help them to grow those mechanisms with the support of international NGOs and international actors, generally speaking, and not the other way around, where you have international agencies that are coming in and basically owning the space that they have honestly no legitimacy in many ways to own. And so here that would be a complete shift. And we have seen that it is an option. Again, I'm as Patrick
and sorry,
said,
I'll add that if I understood Annika well, she's just said that UNHCR is ready to do it. So it sounds like
forward,
now,
you know. No, but interestingly enough, you know, the protection cluster is actually the only global protection, the only cluster we are actually quite involved with, and really supporting also how we can shift the work. So I'm not completely surprised that Annika is saying that, because this is on the protection cluster. This is the sort of shift that slowly but surely we start seeing on how to work better with national actors, how to empower them, how to leave them space, and how also to advocate together for more funding, and not for project funding, but for real capacity funding, core funding for local actors, if I may say. So yeah, I mean, but it's always good to hear it said and reinforced. So thank you.
Well, I'm happy you're both optimistic, but I, for one, would find it really shocking that UNHCR would be ready to say, okay, we're not going to coordinate when it's a refugee response. We're going to take a step back and let local actors do that. So, Annika, am I hearing you right, that you're ready to go tell Filippo Grandi that that's the way forward?
So I think we are talking about two different systems, and I think we need to bear it in mind, because in a refugee context, it's actually the government that coordinates. It really should be the refugee hosting government who coordinates, and international actors who support. And I think sometimes we just equalize everything and think that it's, you know, we sort of made up this system for some reason. But the rationale behind it is this government has territory that it's opened up to people fleeing a conflict. It's already, you know, taken the first step.
When I say the refugee response, I mean kind of coordinating the aid agencies. And yes, in principle, that should be the government. In practice, it isn't often. Yeah.
So anyway, let me just finish my thought, because I think it is kind of interesting. And I mean, it does have some relevance. If you go to an IDP situation where you have a government who is part of the problem, if I'm, you know, completely frank and honest, then obviously that's a bit of a different dynamic. And a lot of the ISC system was sort of set up, honestly, to replace a government that was unable or unwilling, or, you know, because it was a huge shock to a system like a natural disaster, just couldn't coordinate. And I'm not sure that we're in that situation anymore, at least not, you know, year 12 of a conflict, even if it's an internal conflict. So I think for me, it's important to distinguish a little bit between the refugee response that really should be led by the national government in the refugee hosting country, and different kind of IDP responses, which also might have to be differentiated a little bit because they're obviously not all the same, but where you have a very different relationship, and where also local actors have different relationship and different abilities to actually influence what is happening. And I'm talking about local actors such as local NGOs and others. I'm not talking about the local authorities, which is another interesting aspect. Sorry, I'm not sure if I 100% answered your question, but I did want to make the distinction because I was talking specifically about the protection cluster, and I think that's a bit different, just a different set of circumstances.
Thank you for clarifying. I will remind everyone watching that you can ask questions on Twitter, on YouTube, via email, and there is information on your screen for how to do so. Each of these is kind of a world on. We could dig into them in more and more detail, but I'm going to move on to the third recommendation around a different business model. Essentially, your proposal, Patrick, if I've understood it well, once again, is that you would channel most of the funding for field operations to pooled funds at a national, local level, rather than bilaterally through different agencies. And Danny, you have yourself kind of criticized the lack of efficiency in this current model, where there are a number of intermediaries before money gets down to the country level. But you are one of those intermediaries, and more pooled funds at the local level would mean less need for an organization like Oxfam to then subcontract that money down. So what would this kind of a model mean for your role in the future?
So I think it's the same implication for us as I hope it is for every actor in this system, which is, are we clear about how and where we're adding value in this system? Because, surely the issue is that we have created a sort of ecosystem that has far too many intermediaries. There's too much duplication and too many sort of links in the chain, which involve some form of extraction, either of overhead resource or of power. And we're in a deeply suboptimal system. And so I like the direction of travel in this recommendation. I think that, when I worked was a member of the high-level panel on humanitarian financing, we ended up coming up with the sort of grand bargain. But really what we wanted to do was call it a grand reset, right? We ended up for the sort of, let's make incremental change, get buy-in from the key actors, and then, make change. And here we are. Maybe we should have gone for something much more bold, which is around a fundamental reset. And if you'll indulge me, Hiba, I've been reading my history and of Oxfam, and Anika went back to 2004, and I want to go back to 1954 because the Oxford Committee on Famine. No, but like this is relevant. Believe me, Oxford Committee on Famine Relief, which is a volunteer committee, didn't have staff, it didn't have branches. There was no such thing as clusters or international agencies or ODA. What they did was these volunteers went around the world to different crises, Palestine, Korea, India, and they identified local partners, religious group, age-related welfare groups, Red Crescent, Red Cross Society, whoever else might happen upon in the way of local initiatives overseas that they simply funded. So Oxfam's role in the 1950s was to collect money from British people who wanted to support relief or interventions abroad and channel them to local partners. And I raise that point because just to so life was simpler or whatever, I'm not being nostalgic in that sense, but for two reasons. One is, the sort of systems change point that Patrick was raising. We shouldn't forget, we're talking about systems that are really new. We only have to go back 6 decades for a fundamentally different looking system. And so I think we just have to dream of what our system could look like in the next, few years or decades. And the other thing is around the sort of, Alix makes this point really nicely, I think, which is the sort of, we have to see this as a dynamic system that we're influencing, right? So what are we doing now, not just to respond to current needs, whether that's through a cluster system or an area system or whatever we want to call it, but what are we also doing to build more resilience into that system, which I hope involves, supporting local actors, identifying exactly what form will fit that function, and leaning into that, because I think that's we've lost this idea. We've sort of started to instrumentalize all sorts of actors and say, oh, okay, you're important because you're currently doing this, without paying sufficient attention to saying, well, in 10 years time, how might we want this system to look, and what should we be doing now to invest or maximize the chance of that coming to fruition. Thank you for letting me read from history.
But again, I'm hearing you saying, yes, we are ready to get out of the way, and instead of channeling money, we will focus on other things, i.e. building resilience of local actors. Yes,
I think from an Oxfam GB point of view, we're trying to write ourselves into the picture in a very different way. And we have a responsibility around collecting resources in the UK from our supporter base. We have a role on amplifying voice, on global advocacy. But I don't think we really have a role in local delivery or local interventions. We should be facilitating others. And we're busy trying to get out of the way in some of those areas. And, happily in the Oxfam case, we have a global confederation that I hope will allow us to do that more effectively. And that's the sort of bookend for our own history. We started as a volunteer organization that collected resources here and handed them to partners somewhere else. In the last sort of 50, 60 years, we've built a very heavy infrastructure amidst a very crowded ecosystem. And I hope the next few decades is about dismantling the bits of that infrastructure and ecosystem that we don't really need anymore. We probably never needed, but we certainly don't want to have a future system where that. And each of us has to go back to being clear about where is it that we're adding value and where can someone else do it better, especially with a long-term sort of perspective.
I guess where I'm confused is that each of you are kind of saying, yes, all these reforms make sense. And yes, we're happy to do them. And in fact, yes, we are already doing them. And yet we started the conversation by saying the reforms haven't had an impact and we haven't made as much progress as we should have. So where's the disconnect? Is it just that you are the, I'm not being facetious, but the shining stars that are enlightened and kind of seeing things the right way? Or what am I missing here? Why, or is it just that seeing the fruits of these efforts? Silence.
But maybe here, since localization has become such a buzzword, as a network, we have been asked by a lot of our NGOs to help them to think through what localization would mean for them, right? And working with them either on their partnership or their strategy, on how we are functioning, what kind of mechanisms we put in place, what kind of tools our members are using. And sort of the silver lining of all of this is always that the end conversation is always exactly what Danny was talking about. We need to change our business model, and the reality is that I'm not convinced that the majority of international actors are ready to change their business model and are ready to decrease the ecosystem that they have created. Because that, if we are talking about efficiency, that would also mean that their ecosystem needs to become much more aid focused and not humanitarian development, peace building, and then having one branch for everything. But that this really start looking at their role from a broader aid perspective, and that's a lot of changes for a lot of people. So, at least based on our experience, there's a lot of willingness to tweak and to adapt. But the radical change that Danny is talking about, I think this is much more challenging. And this is where it also links to governance, and to have much more diverse and inclusive governance, where you would have global boards with individuals that are also able to lead that change. And when I say more diversity, is also more diversity involving global South. I'm not saying necessarily affected population directly, but global South leaders and actors that are able to bring forward why it makes sense for these organizations to actually change their business model, and where they can support investments. Because again, here, when we are talking about pool funds, one of the things that we are always really worried about is that for a lot of people in the system, pool fund is the equivalent to CBPF, right? So it's OCHA-led pool fund.
Country-based.
There are many other possibilities there's not only the country-based pool fund, and this is where I was talking about investment. This is exactly the kind of investment that we have made as a network, realizing that not many organizations were actually really trying to pilot what it means to have nationally led pool funds that are able to answer to community needs and that are led by people in the countries and that are contextualized, that it's not one size fits all, where you have a mechanism and then you can replicate it across the world depending on where it's needed. And we see at the moment we are piloting one in Somalia, where it is a complete setup from scratch. And then we are piloting in Ghana, where it's using an existing mechanism, which is not a humanitarian mechanism, it's a development foundation, a development Ghanaian foundation, which has taken a role in humanitarian action and trying to see how they can adapt themselves, because they have proven to function, they've been in existence for decades, but how they can adapt to humanitarian response. So these are the kind of mechanisms that ultimately you want to start looking at and investing when you are talking about pool funds and when you are talking about what's the word where you are looking at shrinking a bit the existing international ecosystem and shifting where really the needs are. But it's a shift, it's a shift in this big ecosystem. And then in parallel, you need to have a shift to start investing in the new phase of that ecosystem. You can't expect that it will happen overnight. And this is where, for example, we have been talking quite a lot about the grand bargain, but this is where we're imagining that in the next 2 years, we're going to move things within the grand bargain is questionable. Right? Because what are we going to be able to move in 2 years when we see what has moved in 5 years? And this is where, even if we are in the humanitarian sector where things are supposed to move very fast, reforms are not moving fast. And here we are talking about reforms. We are talking about change. We are not talking about emergency. And this is maybe where sometimes there's also a disconnect.
I guess my question here is what unlocks that, because there's, from this conversation, a clear willingness to be open-minded to different ways of working, to these very specific proposals saying, yes, that makes a lot of sense. And yet we don't necessarily see that follow-on movement. So what's the blockage there that needs to be unblocked? So you made the point about diversity in governance boards, that could be one way of unblocking, because then you have champions at the governance level, and that's of course one of the recommendations. But what else needs to happen for that, or whatever's holding it back to open up some space? Patrick, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, maybe a quick reflection, because I found this discussion fascinating, because I was having a conversation with another large INGO yesterday precisely about the same thing, and basically saying what Danny was saying, that we probably need to move from a model that basically measures humanitarian effectiveness in terms of your own capacity to directly deliver to, how good are you at partnering with local actors and at building their not capacity, but at empowering them to respond. And I think there's actually, even though this panel is very like-minded, there is a lot of nervousness in the sector around this, and in particular from humanitarian donors as well, and from the humanitarian part of NGOs or other agencies, because this is a strategic rethink as to what it means to be humanitarian, right? The sector has spent the past 3 decades, ever since the Rwanda genocide, improving its direct delivery, improving that quality, making sure that what it was delivering was producing quality outcomes. And now we're asking the sector to basically stop and rethink what is actually your unique added value as an international organization, and making sure that you're not displacing whatever capacity and power there is at the local level. And that challenges basically the the current definition, although there isn't one officially, of what humanitarian action is quite fundamental. And I think change will also need to come from donors who will need to accept that, maybe because actually there's no funding that's labeled, you know, capacity building or working with local actors at the moment, because that's not seen as delivering immediately visible humanitarian results, right? So there needs to be a shift there. And I agree with Alex that maybe the next 2 years of the Grand Bargain are not going to produce change, but if we could at least reach an agreement on this, basically that it is probably time now for international actors to have a bit of a rethink as to what their role should be. Not everywhere, because as Annika was saying, there are, and that's the difficulty, that there are places where you will still need that that excellent international humanitarian capacity. So how do you maintain that while at the same time not applying that as a one-size-fits-all, basically? You know, building your capacity to analyze where you will need to step back a little bit and work much more with local actors, as opposed to working more directly, because basically you are in a country where that's the only solution.
Hema, can I just jump in on that? I mean, one of the reasons maybe we all have a sort of frustration about the pace of changes, we're not seeing some of those things that are happening. And, you know, for me, I've been 3 years in this job. I think probably the single most important thing we've been able to do at Oxfam, which we're trying to do now still, is change the key performance indicators of success at Oxfam Great Britain. And we've been working with our trustees on measures that we start with what sources of funding are we most legitimately and credibly placed to secure? Are we crowding others out by going in and bidding for funds? And so we've come to the focus of on, you know, largely on unrestricted income from the UK, which is where we are and where we you know, credibly. Then, you know, proportions of money that are being moved, but we're adding other metrics to that. So in our own dashboard here, we're starting to build in measures around the quality of that funding to local partners. Is it long-term? Is it flexible? And right back where we started, what are the feedback scores? Are we collecting net promoter scores from the partners that we're working with, so that we're getting qualitative indicators of the nature? Now, if we do that well, and more organizations like ours roll that out, eventually that's the sort of stuff that I hope will have more profound implications or changes. It's just not going to be particularly visible, and it's not going to happen overnight.
Heba, may I come in just with, I'll try to be short. Maybe 2 points. So one is, I do think we have to recognize that there has been some, you know, progress made. It's not all, you know, bleak, and it's not all completely just sort of tweaking around the edges. I think many organizations have reached the 25% to national and first round responders. I know for UNHCR, it's 28% of our program expenditure, and that's, you know, a doubling from WHS. So I mean, I'm not saying it's enough.
I'm raising my eyebrows. No, I'm raising my eyebrows because I think the overall funding was something like 2 or 3%. Alex probably has the figure, but overall we were nowhere near the target that was set by the Grand Bargain.
Yeah, no, but is that intermediaries or is that donors? My guess would be that's donors. And I don't have the figures in front of me, but I can speak for UNHCR. It's 28% now, and it's about 62% of all of our partners that are national or local actors. And of our 37 multi-year agreements, 23 are with local partners. And I know, I realize a lot needs to be done, but I don't think we would have got here without the Grand Bargain process. So just Danny, for those who started it in the beginning, I think, you know, don't be completely disheartened, because I do think that, you know, progress is being made. I also I wanted to respond to something that Alex said, because I think that's a key issue when it comes to pool funds. So one of the challenges of pool funds is that they're usually quite tightly earmarked, and they're usually project-based. You know, you submit a kind of a project proposal and you get that project proposal approved. And I do think that Alex is right. When we talk about pool funds, we think about the OCHA-led pool funds, either the SURF or the country-based pool funds, which are both great mechanisms. I mean, they really are great mechanisms. But if we're talking about localization and about empowering local actors and working across the nexus and not focusing only on sort of narrowly meeting needs, humanitarian needs, then the pool funds also themselves, I think, have to change. They just have to, we have to find another way of doing it. And Heba, you'd asked me earlier, you know, could we survive on pool funds? I think probably we, you know, the crux of the matter is that what we would lose if we would only have pooled funds for an agency like UNHCR is we would lose our ability to pre-finance for emergencies, for example. You know, so when Afghanistan goes down, you know, we launch a fast track, we send people, we do all kinds of things, but we have no money in the bank because the donor system doesn't work. Even if there's huge, you know, enthusiasm, the money is not physically in anyone's bank account. You know, even weeks after a pledging conference is nowhere close to anyone's bank account. So that sort of flexibility that comes from unearmarked funding, and Danny was mentioning unrestricted funds from the UK, that's not currently built into the pooled funding mechanism. And I think if we're serious about shifting to pool funds, then we also have to build in something of that nature, because otherwise we just lose the ability. And we're lucky in my agency to have a few, you know, star donors who provide unearmarked flexible funding, but they're a minority. The majority is going the opposite direction, and that's the flip side of the grand bargain. I don't think we've seen the level that we would want to see for all actors in terms of flexible funding arrangements. Anyway, sorry, I'll stop here. I got a bit carried away, but I think the pool fund discussion, it also needs to be about what is the pool fund? You know, what is it and how can we improve that? And not only, you know, is it a good mechanism? Because yes, it's good, but it also needs to evolve.
Heba, can I just add one element, and it's a completely new element that we have not discussed. I would have loved to go back to the pool fund, but I think we need to be careful about time. When you were asking what are the points that are blocking, I think one of the regular and recurring conversation we have is the role of governments, and especially the role of global South government in the humanitarian system. And we see that every time we have brought the issue, not saying that we have an answer, because we don't necessarily have an answer, and we do understand very well that not every country, not every crisis is the same. But there is still a real question on how global South governments are involved in those conversations and have a say on how basically aid and intervention in their countries are decided. And again, there won't be a one size fits all, but that's a very uneasy conversation that always end up with really highly raised eyebrows. But that is a necessary conversation if we really want to move. That, because this is where it's also really critical, is that when you talk about local actors operate in a context that doesn't apply to international actors. So they also have themselves their own challenges to deal with within their own context, being more generally around what we know is happening in many countries where you have a shrinking space for civil societies. How is that supported or protected? But also where national actors have burdens also coming from their own governments that are also themselves protecting themselves from the international system. So here we have a tension that is unfortunately not really discussed. It's discussed maybe country by country, but there's no space really in the global conversation, and we really see that as a missing element and as a blocking element.
We've talked a bit about the blocking elements. We just have a few minutes left, and I want to come to your point, Annika, that actually there are changes happening. And often when we talk about reform in the humanitarian sector, there are kind of 2 points of view. One is these top-down frameworks and mechanisms, and the grand bargain being one of them. And then the other is looking at where grassroots organic examples of change are happening and how they can be supported and scaled. So I wonder if just reflecting on what has worked and where there has been progress, you could give some insights on what will be the most effective engine for humanitarian reform moving forward. Will it be Grand Bargain 2.0, which in my sense doesn't have the same momentum as its predecessor, or will it come from elsewhere? What's working that will be the future of reform in the coming years? Annika, maybe we can start with you.
And that's the most difficult question, and you start with me. So, I mean, it's really hard. I, as I said in the beginning, I do think that the top-down, none of us like top-down, but the top-down high-level panel on financing did provide a lot of impetus for change, and we haven't, for example, talked about cash, and that's another huge, huge empowering mechanism for beneficiaries to get cash rather than in-kind assistance, which I think also was driven in part by the high-level panel on financing. So where does the next one come from? So I do believe that within the system there is willingness to change, but I also think that sometimes competition is not a bad thing, and we all need outside push, outside benchmarks, outside scrutiny, enable to really get out of our own headspace and see things sort of differently and realize where we can change. I think that the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movement actually shows the power of the grassroots in a way that we haven't maybe fully understood within the aid industry. So my hope is really that it would come from the beneficiaries, that the push for change will come from them, and that we would listen to them. That's sort of my hope, but I realize that that's not going to be enough. There also needs to be a push, so to say, from above and from our governance systems, which, at least for the UN agencies, we do have the same member states on our governing board. So it shouldn't be so difficult. I realize that's not the same for all actors around the table. And also from donors who actually, sometimes do have a lot of pet issues and projects that they drive forward, but not always sort of the really global view on terms of how should things change. And then sadly, I think.
Annika, you've just gone on to mute. Sorry,
I was going to say something really negative. I think on the negative side, the things that will force us to change is climate change. I think we completely underestimated what that means in terms of displacement. I'm not talking about UNH. I mean, we people over 40 to have, if I look at what my kids think will change their life, it's climate, and they're, super privileged. So I think that's another element, and I'm sorry we don't have time, and it wasn't really on the agenda for today, but I think that will force change. Sorry, I said it will force us to change, and sorry, I'll hand back to you, Heba.
Thanks. Alix, what do you think will be the main engine for humanitarian reform moving forward?
I would stick on what we have chosen to do, which is to invest in different pots, in the sense that expecting a heavy system to change in itself without any external influences is idealistic. So this is why we invest in other conversation. We invest in piloting outside the system, using the current donors, but piloting elements that we believe are going to support the change of the system. But also we're supporting conversation around having really one outlook at aid and not different outlook at aid. I would want to believe that more voices from the global south is also what's gonna change, and having them more present in the conversation, and not in the global north-led conversation, but in having their own conversation. And we see that this is happening more and more. This is also what's gonna lead the change. On climate change, yes, but
I might stop you there, Alex, just because we're running
yes,
out of time.
absolutely.
Thank you. Danny, your quick thoughts, and then I'll end with you, Patrick.
Disintermediation, everywhere we look in all aspects of our life, systems are being disrupted. And yet if you take the official development assistance system, we've got, taxpayer money going through development ministry, through international organization, through international NGO, eventually to local actors. And it's just cumbersome and nonsensical in so many ways. And, wherever we look, people are innovating or claiming or reclaiming power. And I think we have, we can't put this genie back in the bottle. And so we just need to, quickly adapt and evolve our system so it really delivers impact on the people we're trying to serve, and we're delivering efficiencies. And I think, we can't stick our head in the sand, because every other system around us, from, the way we book travel to the way that we watch entertainment, all of that stuff, these sort of legacy institutions that we once thought were all powerful and could never change are being dismantled. And my worry is the big institution of this sort of relatively new built sector are at risk of being dismantled very quickly if we don't adapt.
Patrick, the last word.
Thanks, Heather. Well, I would agree with everything that's been said before. Of course, I guess the question for me, which I think is what you asked, what's the best vehicle for that? And I agree that it's probably a mixture of pressure coming from the grassroots, and but also from host governments that are increasingly assertive in how they treat the international aid system. But there also has to be some leadership in the system to accept that there needs to be some change. And I think in our conversations with humanitarian leaders over the course of this research, because we've held a number of roundtables in a very iterative process, they all agree that there is a need for at least a forum where time can be spent discussing these issues. And my hope is that basically that is the case. And, it might be the Grand Bargain 2.0, it might be something else. But my hope is that humanitarian leaders that agree that there should be some change should really create that space within the sector, and a bit broader than the sector, I would say, for those discussions to happen.
We are over time, so I'm going to wrap things up there, but I hope this was a helpful reflection on how to rethink humanitarian reform, both in terms of some concrete ideas of what can be done, some examples of what's already being done, and perhaps a deeper understanding of what has held the sector back in the past, and what might work moving forward. Thank you for listening. Thank you for those on the podcast. And I'm sure we'll be continuing the conversation. You will find the research that Patrick has been mentioning on the Center for Global Development website, probably early next week. And of course, the New Humanitarians Rethinking Humanitarianism series continues. So we will see you all online in the future. Thank you very much.